sold stock to his wife to avoid taxes. Richard Whitney, who had so boldly bought stock on Black Thursday, lost money of his own and began borrowing from his brother, and then when that didn't work, he began stealing from customers. He ended up in jail doing time.
The most prestigious bank in America, J.P. Morgan, was also found to be far from blameless. The hearings uncovered evidence of a list that offered preferential deals on stocks to friends in high places, including a former president.
Not only Morgan partners and Morgan family members, but also prominent corporate executives and even some politicians. Calvin Coolidge was on the preferred stock list, for example. That was a practice that a lot of people felt was wrong.
Ferdinand Pecora had a great quote. He said it was shocking disclosures of low standards in high places, which I love because, you could say the same thing today.
In response to public outrage at the bankers' dirty dealings, President Roosevelt set up the Securities and Exchange Commission. Its task, to clean up Wall Street. At its head, he chose a man who knew more about unethical practice than most.
President Roosevelt, when he introduced the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate Wall Street, named his old friend and supporter Joe Kennedy to be the first chairman. And that's putting the fox in the chicken coop.
Although Roosevelt restored confidence in the banking system, the Great Depression would last until the outbreak of World War II. Then, as now, the globalized economy meant that the crash and subsequent depression rippled out across the world. In Britain, there was a slump in manufacturing, and millions lost their jobs. Germany, still suffering from defeat in the First World War, was hit even harder.
So many people had their life savings destroyed during the Great Depression that it created in many countries a desire for some authoritarian government that would save them, that would rescue the economy.
No doubt that crash and the Depression strengthened anti-capitalist movements. The communists had taken over in Russia, and there were rising fascist movements. Mussolini was already in power in Italy, and Hitler's political base was growing in Germany. And when American-style free market capitalism suffered from this Wall Street crash followed by a depression, it just strengthened those people who wanted to say, there's a better way.
While communism and fascism prospered, many nations put up barriers to prevent free trade and turned inwards in an attempt to save their economies. Economic nationalism led to trade wars and later, World War. "80 years on, those who remember the bubble of the 20s and the crash that followed feel that they have seen it all before.
I don't think we learned anything from it. I have found that people's memories are very short. They make the same type of leveraged commitments where they don't look at the downside risk.
You have a lot of cheap credit in the 1920s. Now we've had cheap credit and people have speculated in houses, and now the housing bubble has collapsed.
You have a heavily leveraged American consumer. He's in debt up to his eyeballs, and he can't sustain that debt. The subprime mortgage crisis is a symptom of that.
In the 80s and 90s, faith in the free market had revived. And as optimism returned, many of the financial regulations which Roosevelt had introduced were felt to be outdated and were slowly dismantled. Yet again, a lightly regulated market allowed speculation to grow unchecked.
We are now reaping the whirlwind of that deregulation, and in that sense we're in exactly the same position as people were in 1929 when the government turned a blind eye to what was going on in the financial world.
What I do hope and I do think is that the government has learned its lessons and is trying to take steps that are much more active and much more aggressive than what was taken in the 30s to try and stem the pain and stem the decline.
The hope is that such steps will work. But the lessons from the crash of 1929 are that history repeats itself, that human folly and greed are much stronger forces in financial affairs than reason and restraint.